Well, this section of Genesis, as most of you know, is focused on the life of Joseph. In the book of Genesis, more is said about the life of Joseph than any other person. Chapter 40 really sets the stage for the events of chapter 41. So this is really, part one of a two-part message. You'll have to come back to hear the rest of the story. But remember Joseph's story up to this point. Joseph's brothers despised him, sold him into slavery. He was brought to Egypt, where he was sold to Potiphar and was a slave in Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife made sexual advances to Joseph, but Joseph refused her. And then Potiphar's wife falsely accused Joseph of attempting to rape her. And for that reason, Joseph was imprisoned. And that's where we find Joseph in chapter 40. He's in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Joseph has suffered greatly because of the sins of other people. He has suffered greatly because of the sins of other people. Not because of his own sin, not because he made some bad choices in life. He has been hurt by what other people did to him. And I don't have to tell you that much of our pain and much of our hurt in life comes from other people and the things that they do and the choices that they make that impact us. But despite all that happened to Joseph at the hands of others, Joseph did not become a bitter person. He did not become resentful or angry. Some people become consumed with bitterness and anger because of what others have done to them, and they allow it to define them as a person and define their life, but not Joseph. Joseph didn't blame the people in his life who wronged him. He didn't blame his brothers. He didn't blame Potiphar's wife for what has happened in his life. Neither did he blame God for what has happened to him, as some people do. Joseph didn't see himself as a victim. Instead, Joseph continued to trust the Lord in spite of his unimaginable circumstances. Joseph trusted the Lord. I want you to listen to what it says in Psalm 10, verse 14. Listen to what it says. Psalm 10, verse 14. But you, God, see the trouble of the afflicted. You consider their grief and take it in hand. Listen. The victims commit themselves to you. The victims commit themselves to you. God sees the trouble of the afflicted. He considers their grief, their pain, their sorrow, and the victims, the people who have been victimized by others, the victims commit themselves to the Lord. And that's what Joseph did. He committed himself to the Lord. If you've been wronged by someone, maybe a family member, if you've been mistreated, or if someone has lied about you or falsely accused you or victimized you in some way, you could allow it to consume you. And you could become bitter, or you could commit yourself to the Lord. You could say, what happened to me was awful, what happened to me was terrible and painful, but I'm going to choose to trust the Lord and commit myself to the Lord. I know that God loves me. I know that God cares for me. I know that God sent His Son, Jesus Christ, to die for me on the cross to save me. I know He has a plan for me. I know His plan is good. I'm going to allow Jesus to define who I am and not the things that have happened to me, and I'm going to commit myself to the Lord. That's what Joseph did. Jesus was also betrayed by someone close to him. Jesus was despised. He was rejected by his brethren. He was falsely accused. He was wrongly imprisoned. He was condemned, though he was innocent. And you know what Jesus did? 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23 tells us that when they hurled their insults at Jesus, he did not retaliate. And when he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. Jesus entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He committed himself to the Father. Again, Psalm 10, verse 14, the victims commit themselves to the Lord. And that's what Joseph did. Now, the last verse of chapter 39 says, and the Lord was with Joseph. And the Lord prospered Joseph while he was in prison. And Joseph was put in charge of all the prisoners in the prison. And then chapter 40, verse 1 says, and it came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them. So they were in custody for a while. The king's chief butler and chief baker, those were two very important jobs. The chief butler and chief baker had the overall responsibility for what food and drink was served to the king. They had to ensure the king was not poisoned by an enemy. The chief butler in particular, also known as a cupbearer, he worked in the presence of the king every day. He literally would hand the king his drink. And quite often, the chief butler served as an advisor to the king. Nehemiah, for example, you know the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king of Persia. And Nehemiah used his position as the cupbearer to request to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the city of Jerusalem after the captivity. Now, we're not told why, but for some reason, the chief butler and chief baker of Pharaoh were thrown into prison. They did something that made Pharaoh angry, and Pharaoh put them into prison. Maybe they served Pharaoh something that made him ill. Or maybe Pharaoh ordered a salad with the dressing on the side, and they brought the salad with the dressing on the salad. That can be very frustrating, right? How hard is it just to put the dressing in a bowl? I'm not asking you to invent an entirely new dressing. I'm just saying put it in a bowl, bring it on the side. It's not that hard. Maybe something like that happened. And Pharaoh, instead of just sending it back to the kitchen, sent them to prison. Because he can do that. And we don't know what happened. But they're in prison.